Stories of vampires rising from the grave and feeding on the living have entertained us for 100 years at the cinema. Go further back to books like Dracula by Bram Stoker or Vampire by John Polidori, and you'll see these stories play out across literary fiction. But what about the myths those stories are based upon? Is there any truth to them? There have been accounts of the undead throughout history, but if there's truth in such things, are these creatures still walking on the earth in the most recent of times? One of the most interesting cases of alleged modern vampirism comes from London. In a place called Highgate, hysteria gripped the region throughout the 1960s and 70s as shadowy figures were seen moving between the tombstones of Highgate Cemetery. To this day, there are still urban legends and some first-hand accounts of strange goings-on at the cemetery. It's a fascinating case involving satanic rituals, grave robbing, and even a duel between two legendary vampire hunters. So in tonight's video, let's delve deep and uncover the truth behind the Highgate vampire. Did the undead really terrorize London? Highgate Cemetery was where it all happened. If it were a work of fiction, the cemetery would be the perfect place for the undead preying on passers-by. In fact, it was used as a location for the 1970 vampire film Taste the Blood of Dracula, as well as several other horror films, including Tales from the Crypt. The cemetery was first established in 1839 in the Highgate region of North London. It was created due to local graveyards being unable to cope with a growing number of dead bodies. Many worried that in some of the most overcrowded graveyards throughout the city, the graves would be prone to flooding. This would wash away parts of the rotting bodies into nearby rivers, polluting drinking water reservoirs and spreading disease. It's estimated that Highgate Cemetery holds a staggering 170,000 people, buried in 53,000 graves. Of course, it could be more, with documented cases of murderers and organized criminals disposing of other bodies in freshly dug graves. Intricate stone tombs and passageways were dug directly into the hillside at Highgate, giving ample places for someone or something to hide if being pursued. Some believe that vampires are attracted to grief and pain. Highgate Cemetery has seen its fair share of that. It houses monuments to 97 firemen who were buried there, as well as war memorials for 318 fallen soldiers whose bodies were committed there to this day. When the first sightings of what would go on to be known as the Highgate vampire were recorded in the 1960s, much of the cemetery had fallen into despair. Ivy and other climbing plants had grown over headstones, weaving their way up the sides of forgotten tombs. Trees hung over the once popular cemetery, casting much of it in shadow even during the day. Today, the cemetery has been restored in places by an organization known as the Friends of Highgate. They acquired ownership of the cemetery in 1981, and some suspect that it was a direct response to the many investigative reporters, occultists, and vampire enthusiasts who visited the cemetery in vast numbers throughout the 1970s, either to hunt the undead or to make allegiance with it. The question is, just what went on in Highgate Cemetery? An eerie place like Highgate Cemetery has its fair share of ghost stories and local legends going back 200 years, but the first concrete encounter with a vampire allegedly took place in 1969. In that year, two local people spoke of their strange experiences. The first was an old lady who was walking her dog down Swains Lane in the night. The lane cuts through the graveyard, but she had never been bothered by anyone walking there before. This time was different. The lady told local paranormal enthusiast David Ferrant that while she was walking, she looked up to see a tall figure moving between the headstones. When it turned and looked at her, the old lady said that she felt air turn ice cold. But it's her final claim that adds a supernatural aspect to this encounter. The lady stated confidently that the figure glared at her and started to rise up off the ground as if levitating. She ran off in fear for her life that night. The second encounter in 1969 involved an accountant who had decided to cut through the cemetery one evening out of curiosity. However, unlike the old lady who knew exactly where she was, the accountant lost his way negotiating the many winding paths of the cemetery. He began to grow wary of being lost in such a place with thousands of dead bodies beneath his feet. That was when he heard a loud bell clang nearby. At first, he thought he could follow the sound, thinking that it must have come from a local church. But he soon realized that the bell heralded the arrival of something more sinister. As the bell continued to toll, he noticed that the air grew unseasonably cold. He then experienced what some paranormal experts call the evil eye, which is the sensation of being stared at. He turned quickly, only to see a tall, shadowy figure disappear into thin air. What would have happened to him if he hadn't turned around in that moment, no one knows. Some, however, suspect that he would have gone on to be one of the Highgate vampire's first verified victims, another body added to the thousands already there. Some eternally sleeping, while others are walking when they should not be. After speaking with both witnesses, David Ferrant became a fully fledged paranormal investigator. He decided to spend the night in Highgate Cemetery to see if anything would happen. He was convinced that what the witnesses had seen was probably a large animal or someone playing a prank on people walking through the cemetery. However, if there was something haunting the grounds, then he wanted to know what it was. Curiosity pulled him in, and although he felt he probably wouldn't see anything, in actuality it didn't take long for him to encounter the very thing that was stalking people. Just as midnight approached, he began to feel uneasy. The cemetery was deathly quiet, and David began to second guess whether it had been a good idea to venture into the place so foolhardily and on his own. As the environment began to make him paranoid, he turned only to see a 7-foot-tall figure with red glowing eyes moving between the headstones without its feet even touching the ground. David began to feel as though the figure was draining him of his energy. He was rooted on the spot. With no way to escape, he then recited the Kabbalistic prayer he knew to ward off evil. The figure vanished in response to David and fled from the scene. It's here that the first reports of frightening goings-on in Highgate appeared in the press. David had a letter published in a local newspaper asking if anyone had strange experiences in the cemetery. Many people replied to the letter, and soon the area was abuzz with stories of paranormal entities haunting the cemetery. Those responding wrote of a tall man in a hat wandering around the vaults, a ghostly figure wading into a pond, and even a spectral figure floating between tombs and gravestones. Some of those accounts were published in the newspaper, and that was when another local man named Sean Manchester began to suspect what was really happening in Highgate. This would bring David and Sean together and set up the truly frightening aspects of the Highgate vampire case. On the 27th of February 1970, Sean Manchester gave an interview to a local newspaper. More and more people were claiming to have seen something strange in the cemetery, and they wanted to know what it was. Sean claimed to have the answers. In the interview, he proposed that Highgate Cemetery was in the clutches of, and I quote, a king vampire of the undead. Through his own research, Sean believed that the vampire had once been an aristocrat and occultist. When this man died, his followers brought his body from Romania to London and then buried him in the hill overlooking the area. At that time, the area would have been unused, but after the body was placed there, the hill had been repurposed as a cemetery. Sean claimed that for all that time, the body had been dormant. However, Satan worshippers had carried out rituals in the cemetery, thinking that it was abandoned, and had unwittingly awoken the aristocrat, who was now growing in power with each day. To back up his claims that the thing in the cemetery was in fact a vampire, Sean told the press that he had met 2 young women who had been preyed upon by the creature. One was a schoolgirl who had walked past the cemetery at night and had seen the figure watching her. She then began having nightmares about the shadowy figure climbing in through her bedroom window. When the girl became anemic due to blood loss and appeared to have 2 teeth marks on her neck, it became evident to Sean that the creature might in fact be a vampire. he placed crucifixes in the girl's room along with garlic and holy water, and that made the dreams stop. She soon regained her health after that. The second person Sean had spoken with was a woman named Jacqueline. She told him that she had woken one night to find that something was in her room squeezing her hand with an icy touch. Later, thinking that it was a dream, Jacqueline soon realized that she had cuts on her wrist and hand where she had tried to free herself. Sean Manchester kept a close eye on Jacqueline, and he soon concluded that she and her brother were both walking to the western side of the cemetery in a daze, as if drawn to it. This was when he truly became certain that he was indeed dealing with a vampire, and that it resided in that part of the cemetery. But where? There were thousands of graves. It would take a monumental effort to find out which one contained the evil creature. It's simple to discount Sean and David's experiences as the product of fantasy, but there were some things going on at that cemetery at that time that led people to think that there was something to these stories. Candles and ritualistic markings were found at the cemetery, backing up the idea that satanic rituals were being carried out there at night. This added credence to Sean and David's claims that an evil presence had been awoken as a result. When several dead foxes were found in the cemetery, local newspapers, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, reported that the animals were found to have been drained of their blood. Police records also show that in 1968, just 1 year before the Highgate vampire sightings became commonplace, a grave had been desecrated in Tottenham Park Cemetery, which was nearby. A grave had been uncovered and someone had driven a wooden stake through the chest of its occupant. On Friday the 13th of March 1970, the British television channel ITV broadcast a documentary about the Highgate vampire. It featured both David Ferrand and Sean Manchester as well as others, talking about their experiences at this cemetery. By this time, David and Sean had become enemies, belittling each other in the press. This stoked more interest in the feuding paranormal investigators and culminated in both men agreeing to a showdown inside the cemetery. This was touted as a test of power to see whether each of them had the ability through various rituals to see off the vampire once and for all. The magical duel, as it was promoted, never actually happened. Instead, both men continued to claim that they were the only ones who could rid the area of the evil presence. After the broadcast of the documentary, the Highgate vampire became a national news item. People flocked from across the UK to visit the cemetery. Some were just curious, but others claimed that they too wanted to defeat the undead. However, there were more macabre aspects to what was happening in the cemetery at that time, and these unsettling events were often overshadowed by David and Sean's feud. Unknown individuals were digging up bodies from the cemetery and putting them in strange places around the area. Unbelievably, one person who lived in the area even found one of the dead bodies inside of his car, sitting at the steering wheel. While some have suggested that the bodies were members of the undead, we know for a fact that human beings were involved in one particularly grisly instance. The mutilated body of a woman was found at the foot of the hillside, where some of the old tombs stretched deep underground. The body had been decapitated and burned beyond recognition. Police reports indicate that they believe the body had been used in a genuine satanic ritual. As the hysteria grew around the supernatural activity at the cemetery, both Sean Manchester and David Ferrand attempted to finally dispatch the creature. David didn't believe that it was a vampire, and instead believed it was actually a spirit or demon. He decided to communicate with the entity by carrying out rituals with the group Wiccan practitioners. It took 3 attempts, but during the 3rd ritual, one of the practitioners was enveloped by a black shroud. She survived, but later said that she felt 2 icy cold hands wrapped around her neck, trying to strangle her. This was enough to let David know that the entity was indeed evil. After carrying out more research, David claimed that the cemetery resides on a ley line. These lines are believed by some to be the remnants of structures erected by ancient peoples such as the Druids. They are said to carry earth energies and have become synonymous with ghosts and other supernatural phenomena. David claimed that the Highgate entity was a malevolent spirit moving along this ley line, only able to move along it. To support his claims, he found the instances of a shadowy figure being seen in other places outside of the cemetery where the line supposedly runs. David was eventually arrested for entering the cemetery late at night, carrying ritualistic items. The case was dropped in court, and this was as far as David ever got with the entity. Sean Manchester, on the other hand, claims to have disposed of the thing for good, and for him it was most definitely a vampire. A few months after the headless and charred woman's body was found in the cemetery, Sean and his close associates claimed to found the tomb of the vampire. When they broke inside, they saw a horribly emaciated figure lying in an ornate black coffin that they were convinced was the figure terrorizing locals. Just as Sean was about to drive a stake through its chest, he was stopped by one of his companions because he would have gone to jail for desecration. Instead, they placed crucifixes around the tomb and carried out a blessing, hoping that it would be enough. One of the caretakers for the cemetery helped seal the tomb up. Unfortunately, according to Sean, this didn't hold the evil back for long, and locals were still being secretly preyed upon by it, though they didn't want to come forward to the press due to the media circus. After this event, the tomb was opened by someone and the body was moved to an unknown location. Sean believed that the vampire had its own human servants and that they were the ones who moved the coffin. All that Sean could do was hunt for the creature each day with his colleagues. It took 3 years, but they eventually found the same black coffin in the basement of an old abandoned mansion nearby. There, they threw off the lid and saw what Sean described as a figure even more distorted than I remembered it. Far worse than even that time in the Highgate vault, its burning, fierce eyes under the many-furrowed brow were staring, yellow at the edges with blood-red centers, unlike anything imaginable. The mouth was set in a cruel expression, the lips drawn back. Sean claims then to have impaled the creature through the heart with a wooden stake. The body then caved in on itself and began to crumble. Sean and his associates then burned the body, certain that they had defeated the evil terror of Highgate Cemetery, once and for all. The Highgate vampire case remains a fascinating episode in the history of paranormal claims. Sean and David maintained for decades that the more ridiculous aspects of the case, such as the magician's duel, were fabricated by the press, though they were both quoted about it at the time. Was it all just hysteria, a perfect example of how some urban legends can grow arms and legs and significantly affect people's actions? Or was there more to it? The satanic rituals seem to have been real enough. Who was behind them? It's easy for us to push the entire fiasco aside as two men playing at being Van Helsing in an old cemetery, but what if there's a grain of truth to the tale? David Ferrant passed away in 2019, but maybe he was right about the evil entity, and it still exists there, vampire or not. After all, people still claim to see something walking through the tombstones and vaults of the Highgate Cemetery to this very day. Perhaps in Highgate, the undead does indeed still live. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to join my Discord at discord.gg/Matthew Santoro and follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Matthew Santoro. Both communities are amazing, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Be sure to join me in the next video as well. I'll see you then.